Today, we are digging into a truly wild, almost forgotten chapter of American history. We're talking swastikas, stormtroopers, even paramilitary training camps. But not in 1930s Germany. No, this was happening just outside of cities like Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah, you heard that right. During the absolute depths of the Great Depression, a fierce ideological war was being fought in the suburbs and on the streets of the American heartland. It's a story that sounds almost unbelievable, but it's one we absolutely need to understand.
So you gotta picture the scene. It's the 1930s. The economy has collapsed. Millions of people are out of work. And for a lot of them, it felt like the whole system was broken. So, naturally, people started looking for radical answers. And that created the perfect breeding ground for extremist ideologies to really take hold.
And the fascist threat here, it wasn't just one thing. It was like a two-headed monster. On one side, you had the German-American Bund. Think of them as a direct import, an extension of Hitler's party trying to turn German immigrants into Nazis. But on the other side, you had the Silver Shirts, a completely homegrown movement that wrapped its fascism in a really twisted version of American patriotism.
And believe me, these movements had some seriously dangerous leaders. Fritz Julius Kuhn literally called himself the American Führer. But then you've got this other guy, William Dudley Pelley, and his story is just bizarre. He was a Hollywood screenwriter who became a mystic and a white supremacist, and he founded the uniquely American Silver Legion. And then you had guys on the ground like George Frobos and Fritz Mathis, who were the ones actually organizing the rallies and training the stormtroopers in the Midwest.
Now, the Bund was incredibly clever with their propaganda. They were always waving American flags, talking about being 100% American. But this quote right here, this shows their real goal: a white, Gentile-ruled America. They were just hiding their vicious, anti-Semitic Nazi ideology behind a patriotic mask, calling Roosevelt's New Deal the Jew deal and ranting about conspiracies.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the Silver Shirts for a minute. Because in a lot of ways, this was the weirder and maybe even more dangerous threat. This wasn't an ideology imported from Europe. This was American-made fascism, custom-built for disgruntled, native-born citizens.
So that guy, William Dudley Pelley, he founded the Silver Legion the very day after Hitler took power in Germany. Coincidence? I don't think so. He created this just bizarre cocktail of spiritualism, nasty anti-Semitism, and white supremacy, and he called his followers a Christian militia. They were basically preying on the fears of working-class white Americans who felt totally left behind by the Great Depression.
And of course, they had a uniform. It was designed to look both militaristic and somehow American. But the really striking part was this bright scarlet letter L they wore over their hearts. Pelley claimed it stood for love, loyalty, and liberation. Just think about that. A chillingly deceptive slogan for a movement that was built on pure hatred. But here's the good news. As this fascist tide started to rise, it didn't go unopposed. In fact, it was met with a really sophisticated and powerful counteroffensive. This wasn't a community that just sat back and watched. Oh no. They organized, they fought back, and in the process, they created an amazing blueprint for how to defend democracy.
And the resistance had its own incredible leaders. Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver was a true moral giant in the community, a national voice with amazing organizing skills. He teamed up with Leon Wiesenfeld, a newspaper editor who knew exactly how to fight a propaganda war. And then you have the Metcalf brothers, one of whom was a former G-man, who risked everything to go deep undercover inside the Bund itself. And their strategy was just brilliant. The League for Human Rights didn't just hold protests. They fought a two-front war. First, they hit them in the wallet with economic sabotage, a massive boycott of all German-made goods. And second, they basically became their own civilian spy agency. They gathered intelligence, meticulously investigated, and then exposed these domestic fascists and their networks, which made it almost impossible for them to operate out in the open.
So, as the 1930s dragged on, the conflict just got more and more intense. The war of words and propaganda eventually spilled out into the real world, turning the streets of Cleveland and its quiet suburbs into an actual physical battlefield.
And this part is just so chilling. The nerve center for all Nazi operations in the Midwest, it wasn't some hidden bunker. It was the German Central Farm, a 30-acre community space in Parma, Ohio, that the Bund aggressively took over and turned into their personal indoctrination center. You know, from the outside, it just looked like a farm. But inside, it was a hub for paramilitary training, where stormtroopers drilled under their national leaders. It was a site for indoctrinating kids in camps modeled directly on the Hitler Youth. They even held rifle tournaments, competing against teams back in Berlin.
It was basically a full-blown Nazi enclave right on American soil.
So, with all this tension building, you just knew something had to give. And when it finally did, the scale of it was staggering. Just let this number sink in for a second. 1,700. That's not the number of protesters. That's how many police officers were needed to control a single violent event. And this was the climax. In February of 1939, at the exact same time as that infamous Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, the Bund held what they called a pro-Americanism rally in Cleveland. Of course, anti-Nazi protesters showed up to confront them, and the whole thing just devolved into a massive street brawl. It was a full-blown riot that needed that huge police force just to contain the chaos.
But then, one single event on the world stage changed everything. The attack on Pearl Harbor. In a flash, the line between just having abhorrent beliefs and committing outright treason was crossed. And that's when the full weight of the U.S. government finally came crashing down on these domestic fascist movements.
After Pearl Harbor, there was no more playing around. Within hours, the FBI, using all that intel that groups like the League for Human Rights had gathered for years, conducted synchronized raids all across the country, arresting the entire leadership. This all led to the 1944 Great Sedition Trial, and while that trial itself actually ended in a mistrial, the legal costs and the public exposure completely shattered their entire network for good.
And really, there's no better symbol for how this whole thing ended than the fate of the German Central Farm itself. On the left, you see what it was in the 1930s, a hotbed of American Nazism. But on the right, by 1976, it had been totally reclaimed. It was restored to its original purpose as a peaceful community center, which is just the perfect symbol for the ultimate victory of pluralism over hate.
So what do we take away from all this? This story didn't happen in some faraway land. It happened right here in the American heartland. It's a sobering reminder of how quickly extremist ideas can take root in times of crisis. But, it also gives us a powerful blueprint for how a determined, organized, and brave community can fight back. It reminds us that defending democracy is never, ever a spectator sport.
We're about to dive into a chapter of American history that, frankly, sounds like it couldn't possibly be true. We're talking about a time in the 1930s when swastikas were flying high, not in Berlin, but right here in the American heartland. I mean, just think about that for a second. A full-on summer camp for American kids with uniforms, Nazi salutes, the whole 9 yards. Does that sound like something out of a dystopian novel? Or could that have actually been a reality here?
Well, it was. Right in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, this was absolutely happening. And we're not talking about just a few extremists in a basement somewhere. This was an organized, well-funded movement with surprisingly deep roots.
So, how on earth did this happen? Well, it all starts with the Great Depression. You have to imagine the chaos, especially in industrial cities like Cleveland. People were desperate, unemployment was rampant, and there was this growing feeling that democracy itself was failing. In that kind of environment, it's the perfect storm for really radical ideas to take root. You can actually trace the movement's evolution, and it was so deliberate. It started out innocently enough in 1924 as a German immigrant social club called Teutonia. But then, boom, 1933, it becomes the Friends of New Germany, taking orders directly from the Nazi Party. And then, in what was basically a cynical marketing ploy in 1936, they rebranded as the German-American Bund to cloak themselves in patriotism, all led by their new American Führer, Fritz Kuhn. And that rebranding, that was their whole game plan. The German-American Bund were absolute masters of camouflage. They would wrap their loyalty to a foreign dictator in the American flag, using all these patriotic symbols to hide a really dangerous subversive agenda. And here was their official slogan. Just listen to the language. On the surface, it sounds kind of patriotic, right? But it's all coded. It's a direct appeal to white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And it was so carefully crafted to sound like they were defending American values when they were really pushing Nazi ideology. This really shows you the deep deception at the heart of the whole thing. Publicly, they preached 100% Americanism, said they loved the Constitution, but behind closed doors, members were swearing secret oaths of loyalty to Hitler. They claimed to be anti-communist, but really, they were just pushing the disgusting Judeo-Bolshevism conspiracy. And FDR's New Deal, in their propaganda, that became the Jew Deal. And make no mistake, this was not some disorganized mob. It was a well-oiled machine, a hierarchy. You had the American Führer, Fritz Kuhn, sitting at the top. Under him, you had regional bosses like George Froboise running the Midwest, and then local guys like Joseph Balahovic in Cleveland. And of course, you had enforcers like Fritz Mathis, the drill master, keeping the stormtroopers in line. This structure is what let them operate so effectively all across the country. So, with the organization all set up, they needed a physical base, a place to train, to rally, to indoctrinate. And they found it in a suburb of Cleveland, on this huge piece of land they called Deutsche Zentrale, which just means German Central. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, we're talking about a 30-acre compound. This wasn't just some rented hall. It was a fortress, bought by what seemed like a harmless cultural group and then slowly transformed by the Bund into their headquarters. The setup itself was so deceptive. At first glance, you think, oh, it's a community center. It's got a pool, soccer fields, tennis courts. But then you look closer. There's also an active rifle range and barracks. They literally militarized a community space, turning it into a hub for paramilitary training. Then, in 1937, they rolled out the German labor service right there at the farm, and this was directly copied from the forced labor service in Nazi Germany. Members were essentially forced to build up the compound under this really strict authoritarian control. This was Nazi ideology being built brick by brick right on American soil. But honestly, the most chilling part of this whole story is what they did to the kids. The Bund's youth movement targeted American children, some as young as 8. At their summer camps, they'd put them in Hitler Youth-style uniforms, teach them to sing Nazi songs, and make them perform the Hail Hitler salute to the swastika. This was the systematic psychological conditioning of a whole generation of American kids. But, and this is so important, the people of Cleveland did not just stand by and watch this happen. As the threat got bigger and more obvious, a really sophisticated and organized resistance started to form. And this resistance was a true coalition. You had powerful leaders like Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver and the journalist Leon Wiesenfeld. They worked alongside social reformers like Mildred Chadsey, and even incredibly brave investigative journalists like the Metcalf brothers, who actually went undercover to expose the Bund from the inside. And their tactics were just brilliant. The League for Human Rights organized this really effective economic boycott of German goods, but they also acted like a civilian spy agency, documenting everything the Bund did, unmasking their propagandists, and publicly calling out anyone who gave these guys cover. They fought back on every single front. For years, this was a fierce cultural and political war being fought in Ohio. But the final chapter? Well, it was written by world events. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, changed everything in an instant. Overnight, the Bund went from being a political movement to a network of enemy agents. And the end came so fast. I mean, within hours of the attack, the FBI was raiding Bund headquarters all over the country, arresting the leadership. German nationals were declared enemy aliens. And then the final nail in the coffin was the Great Sedition Trial of 1944, which just completely shattered what was left of their network. The threat was absolutely real, but in the end, it was defeated. The German-American Bund was legally dismantled, its leaders were jailed or deported, and their paramilitary compounds were shut down for good. You know, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. The story of the German-American Bund is such a powerful reminder, a warning about how easily extremism can find a home, but also an inspiring story of how a community can unite and fight back. It really leaves us with a critical question. What lessons from this history can we apply to the fight against organized hatred today?